In the previous video, we have discussed about pollination, kinds of pollination, as well as pollination that is achieved or mediated by abiotic agents. So what are those abiotic agents that help in pollination? They are wind and water. And we have already also discussed that how the wind pollinated flowers as well as water pollinated flowers have been adopted the structure of flowers such that they can achieve pollination. Okay. So in water pollinated flowers we had discussed about the examples of Vallisneria as well as seagrass that is named as Zostera. And in wind pollinated flower we have discussed about the inflorescence of grass or the corn cobs. So today we will discuss about the pollination by biotic agents. So what are those biotic agents that help in pollination? So there are a wide range of biotic agents that usually help the plants to achieve pollination. So some of those biotic agents that mainly help in pollination are bees, butterflies, wasps, beetles, birds, bats, snakes and many other animals. So there are a wide range of animals or insects that mainly help in pollination. So among these biotic agents, there are certain biotic agents, especially the bees which are considered as dominant pollinating agents because these bees pollinate majority of the flowering plants or majority of the flowers. So they are considered as dominant pollinating agents. And coming to the birds, even in birds there are different types of birds which help in pollination. For example, there are sunbirds, there are hummingbirds which achieve pollination. So these are different pollinating agents or biotic pollinating agents. So to achieve pollination or if pollination takes place with the help of these biotic agents, the flowers should have certain adaptations in them. So to achieve pollination, the flowers of certain angiosperms have been adopted in such a way that they can be pollinated by many of these pollinating agents. For example, there are certain angiosperms which are pollinated by bees. So those flowers which are pollinated by bees have got a different adaptation, and those flowers which are pollinated by birds have got a different adaptations. So flowers have been adopted in such a way that they are very specific to the type of pollinating agents. Okay. So next let us discuss about certain other species of animals which help in pollination. So in addition to these animals, there are certain animals. For example, animal that is included under primate. Some of the primate like lemurs, arboreal rodents, and there are some of the reptiles. Like gecko lizard, garden lizards also help in pollination. So pollination may be achieved by a wide range of biotic pollinating agents. So now let us see what are the adaptations seen in flowers so that they can be pollinated by different species of animals. So let us take an example of bird pollinated or insect pollinated flower. So the insect pollinated flowers usually are large, they are brightly colored, they secrete certain fragrance and they also produce nectar. Okay, so these are certain characteristic features of those flowers which are pollinated by bees. The same way, there are different characteristic features for a flower or flowers are adopted such that they can be pollinated by certain species of animals or certain species of birds. So what are those characteristic features the insect pollinated flowers have? The insect pollinated flowers are large, they are brightly colored, and they produce nectar as well as they give fragrance, or they secrete fragrance. Okay, and there are certain species of flowers which are mainly pollinated by certain beetles or flies. So beetles and flies are mainly attracted not for the good fragrance, they are usually attracted for somewhat foul odor. Okay, for the foul or foul smell, the beetles as well as the flies are attracted. So flowers, based on the type of the pollinating agents that achieve pollination, they have certain characteristic features. So why do these pollinating agents, or why do these animals visit the flower? Is it their intention to achieve pollination, or do they have any other intention? Usually the pollinating agents, they are not mainly, or they are not visiting the flowers mainly with the intention of pollination. They mainly visit varieties of flowers mainly to collect the nectar or to collect the pollen grains, because pollen grain, as you have studied earlier, pollen grain are rich in nutrients. So to collect these pollen grains as well as to collect the nectar that is produced inside the flower, the pollinating agents or animals or birds visit the flowers. So whenever they visit the flower to collect these rewards, we can consider them as rewards. So whenever the pollinating agents visit the flower to collect the rewards, by chance the pollen grains get deposited on the surface or on the body of these pollinating agents. So when such a pollinating agent, where the pollen grains are dusted on the body of the pollinating agent, when they visit another flower, what happens? They will enter the flower, they will try to suck the nectar. So meanwhile, the pollen grain that is deposited on the back of the, or on the body surface of such a pollinating agent, will drop on the stigma. So by chance pollination will be achieved. So this is how pollination takes place in varieties of flowers or various species of flowers. Now let us recall what are the rewards that are given by flowers for pollinating agent. As I mentioned earlier, the rewards are nectar, collection of nectar, collection of pollen grains. But there are certain flowering plants, or there are certain species of plants where the pollinating agents visit the flower mainly because of the rewards, like giving shelter. There are certain flowers which give shelter to the pollinating agents, and there are certain flowers which give a safe place for laying the eggs of these pollinating agents. So we can consider that the rewards that are obtained by the animals or pollinating agents whenever they visit the flower are nectar, pollen grains, safe place for laying their eggs, as well as shelter. So we will take an example for that species of flowers which gives safe place for laying the eggs. There is a flower named Amorphophallus, a flowering plant named Amorphophallus. And you know what is the speciality of this flower or flowering plant? This flowering plant or this flower is considered as tallest flower. The flower produced by these plants are tallest flower. And do you know how tall these flowers are? The flower itself is 6 feet tall. Flower itself, not the plant, flower itself is 6 feet tall. So these flowers, or the tallest flower, Amorphophallus, gives a safe place for laying the eggs of certain flies or certain wasps. Okay. So we will take one more example of such flowers which give safe place for laying the eggs for pollinating agent. So there is a plant named yucca plant. A plant named yucca or yucca species yucca plant. So this plant is visited by certain moths. Plant is visited by certain moths. So why do these moths visit the yucca plant? The moths usually visit the yucca plant and they reach the flower of the yucca plant. They enter the flower of the yucca plant and lay the eggs inside the ovary of the flower. Moths visit the yucca plant, they visit the yucca flower, they enter the flower and they lay eggs. Where do they lay the eggs? They lay the eggs inside the ovary. Inside the ovary of the yucca flowers. So, why they lay the eggs inside the ovary? Because it is the safest place for laying the eggs. So, whenever these moths enter the flower, enter the ovary and lays the eggs, accidentally the pollen grains get deposited on the body of the moths. And the same moth, when it visits the other flower, what happens? Pollen grains will be deposited on the stigma of other flower. So what is achieved there? Pollination is achieved. So these two species, that is yucca plant as well as moth species, they have a close relationship. So this close relationship is mutual relationship. So both these organisms or both these species cannot complete their life cycle without each other. That is known as mutual relationship. Yucca plant as well as moth species cannot complete their life cycle without each other. How do they cannot complete their life cycle without each other? Moth is dependent on yucca flower for laying the eggs because it is a safe place for laying the eggs, whereas the yucca plant is benefited because moths help in pollination, right? And inside the ovary, the eggs remain inside the ovary. Eggs of the moths will remain inside the ovary, and inside the ovary you have studied that there will be ovules. So what happens to the ovules? Ovules, when the flowers develop into fruits, the ovules will transform into seed. So when ovules transform into seed, the eggs will develop into larvae and larvae will come out of the ovary. Okay? The eggs that are laid inside the ovary, when the ovary, inside the ovary, when ovules develop into seeds, when ovules develop into seeds, the eggs of moth will develop into larvae and then the larvae form a new organism. So this is how there is mutual relationship between yucca plant as well as moth. Okay? So these are certain amazing phenomena that takes place in nature, and it is very interesting to study this. So you can visit your garden or you can observe some of the flowering plants and you can note down what are those pollinating agents that mainly visit the flowers and which are those pollinating agents that achieve in pollination. And you have to remember that all those organisms, it may be birds, beetles, wasps or any of the flies, all those organisms or agents that visit the flowers may not always help in pollination, because there are certain group of organisms or there are certain group of animals or biotic agents. They will visit the flower, they will take up the pollen grains or they will suck the nectar, but they will not help in pollination. So such organisms or such species which visit the flower, take the nectar, eat the pollen grains, but they do not help in pollination, are commonly called as nectar robbers or pollen robbers. Pollen robbers, or they are also called as nectar robbers. Why are they called as robbers? They simply steal the nectar or the pollen grain, but they will not help in achieving pollination.
Flowers are mainly responsible for bringing about fertilization and seed formation. To facilitate fertilization, it is necessary that the male gametes inside the pollen grains and the female gamete inside the ovule are brought together. However, since the gametes are immotile, pollen grains have to be transferred to the stigma. This process of transfer of pollen to the stigma of a flower, brought about by agents such as insects, wind and water, is called pollination. Pollination can be of two types: self-pollination and cross-pollination. When pollination takes place within the same flower or between flowers of the same plant, it is known as self-pollination. In plants, self-pollination can occur either through autogamy or geitonogamy. In autogamy, pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. And is seen in cleistogamous flowers or flowers which do not open at all, produced by plants such as viola, oxalis, camelina, and Arachis hypogea or peanut. The anthers and stigma of these flowers lie very close to each other. When anthers dehisce, pollen grains get deposited on the stigma, which ensures the production of seed sets even in the absence of pollinators. Autogamy, however, is rare in chasmogamous flowers, which open and expose their anthers and stigma, as it requires synchrony between pollen release and stigma receptivity. In geitonogamy, the second type of self-pollination, pollen is transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Apart from self-pollination, cross-pollination is also commonly seen in plants. This type of pollination involves the transfer of pollen grains from the flower of one plant to the stigma of the flower of another plant of the same type. This type of pollination is called xenogamy or allogamy. Interestingly, xenogamy is the only type of pollination that brings genetically different types of pollen grains to the stigma. In both cross-pollination and self-pollination, pollinating agents play a vital role. These agents include biotic agents such as insects, birds, bees, butterflies, and mammals such as bats, as well as abiotic agents such as wind and water. Incidentally, pollination in a majority of plants is aided by biotic pollinating agents, which get attracted by flowers which vary from each other to attract their specific pollinator. Insect-pollinated flowers, for instance, are usually large and fragrant. However, if they are small, they are bunched together in an inflorescence to make them conspicuous. Moreover, these flowers produce pollen grains as well as large quantities of nectar to reward the agents. When a pollinating agent comes in contact with the anther, its body gets covered in a coat of sticky pollen grains. When the agent sits on another flower to suck the nectar, the pollen present on their bodies comes into contact with the stigma, thus completing the process of pollination. Conversely, flowers pollinated by butterflies are usually lightly scented and brightly colored, with nectar not very deeply hidden, while those pollinated by beetles and flies secrete a rotten odor. Flowers pollinated by birds, on the other hand, have large, odorless, orange or red tubes which are rich in honey. Certain plants attract pollinating insects by offering them shelter. For instance, Amorphophallus, a 6-foot-tall flower, attracts pollinating insects by offering them a safe haven to lay their eggs. In the yucca plant, on the other hand, a female moth transfers the pollen of another flower to the stigma and simultaneously deposits her eggs in the locule of the flower's ovary. The larvae, which hatch out of the eggs, start consuming some of the developing seeds, while leaving enough of them to propagate the plant. Thus, both the moth and the plant are dependent on each other for the completion of their respective life cycles. However, certain birds and insects such as the bumblebee visit flowers for nectar and pollen, but don't bring about pollination. These creatures are referred to as pollen robbers. Honeybees, as well as other insects, also pollinate a large number of aquatic flowering plants, such as the freshwater lily. However, in certain freshwater plants such as Vallisneria and Hydrilla, and marine seagrasses such as Zostera, pollination occurs by water. This is also known as hydrophily. In Vallisneria, for example, the female plant produces a long-stalked female flower that reaches the surface of the water. The male plant, on the other hand, remains submerged in water, where it produces several tiny floral buds. Upon maturing, the buds rise to the water's surface and open up to expose the anthers. Pollen released from the anthers is carried by water currents, where some of them eventually come in contact with the stigma. In the case of Zostera, a dioecious seagrass, the male and female flowers remain submerged in water. The male flowers produce long and ribbon-like pollen grains which have a mucilaginous covering that protects them from getting wet. The pollen released in water is carried by water currents towards the submerged stigma, and thus pollination is completed. Surprisingly, in aquatic plants, wind pollination, also called anemophily, is more widespread than water pollination. Wind pollination also occurs in terrestrial plants such as grass, bamboo, coconut, and maize. These plants possess a compact inflorescence with well-exposed stamens that allow easy dispersal of pollen, and a large feathery pistil which makes it easy to trap pollen. The pollen, which is light and non-sticky, is produced in large quantities. A single flower of cannabis, for instance, produces 5 lakh pollen grains to compensate the loss of pollen associated with wind pollination. Thus, wind, water, as well as biotic pollinating agents bring about pollination. An important process that ultimately leads to fertilization and the production of seeds in plants.